welcome to our boardroom session. And I have a fantastic board here with me that's going to be discussing some very important issues. I'm Ayla Goksel, and to my right I have Lord Michael Hastings and Matt Greenfield from Rethink Education, Anne Black from Goldman Sachs Gives, and Dixit Joshi, Managing Director of Deutsche Bank. So the format is basically very free for all. So I'm hoping that we're going to have some lively discussions. And I'm also hoping that we're going to have about 5 to 7 minutes towards the end where you can ask any questions, burning questions that you have. And if I forget to do that, someone please remind me, but I won't, I promise. So as I said, I'm only going to intervene if there's a lull in the conversation, which I doubt there will be, even though I have a long list of backup questions. But I'm going to start to my right with Lord Michael Hastings. When was the last time that you actually discussed social impact at your board meeting?
Thursday.
Fantastic. Tell us what the conversation was about.
Well, the reason was because the KPMG board meeting in Paris received a detailed report from me about our disaster relief fund. And that was in consequence to the earthquake in Mexico City last September, the hurricanes which swept across the Caribbean, also affected Florida and Texas, but more significantly, the incredible rains which affected Nepal, Bangladesh, and northern India, where the greatest deaths were. So we set aside a global allocation of money, but then we raised funds from all 155 countries in the network, and then my duty is to present all of that information. The board has to receive the recommendation, which is to work with the Red Cross, but also we have to delineate exactly how different aspects of the funds will be used. And as you're probably aware, there's been a lot of concern about charitable money through independent foundations or certainly aid agencies. So we've also set some criteria in for oversight to make sure that any KPMG people who are working directly in hands-on disaster engagements, which we did have in Florida or we had in Japan, for example, after the earthquake, that we know exactly who's doing what and where they're accountable to. But yes, we literally Thursday, so I'm glad I was able to say that.
Okay, great. And what was the most challenging question that you got from your board?
That the difference between how much we as an organization of 198,000 people in 155 countries should do as compared to what should the nature of partnership be with non-governmental organizations and what they do. Inevitably, I think it would be fair to say way back, as some of us are old around the table, certainly I am, but way back into the sort of 70s, 80s, NGOs did everything that companies didn't want to touch. Now, increasingly, companies will willingly be actively involved in disasters, emergencies, relief, but also in development, ecology, environment, sustainability, will be involved in societal impact setting. We were the first business in the UK to lead the living wage campaign and process, which then became UK law. We set that template now for all of our businesses around the world. And when you then say directly as a company, you're going to be involved in something that would have been seen as public advocacy or would have been seen as a social campaign issue or would have been seen as NGO territory, where does the company stop? Where does the NGO begin? And we have to recognize our weaknesses and therefore things we can't do. But how do we then demonstrate to the rest of the business that actually, when you are a people business full of very skilled, engaged, committed, passionate people, and you have resources, and you have presence, and you have accountabilities, can you meet some of the gap needs that even NGOs, UN agencies, and others can't meet? The answer to that is yes, you can. And so it's how far do we go? And that's a very challenging discussion right now, where confidence in some of the NGOs is at a lower ebb, confidence in business is still at a reasonable ebb. What's the role we play in that?
And I think also, in addition to the sort of making the decisions about the financial and what percentage you're putting into any disaster or any foundation or whatever it might be, I think what we'we've also seen with our board, thankfully, is that they really see that this is an important culture building tool. And so a firm like ours, Goldman Sachs, where we're much smaller than your firm, but about 35,000 people, interestingly, about 50% of whom would be considered millennial generation. This is important, and if we want to recruit and retain the best talent, studies show one after the next that these are really important programs. And so we can talk about how it's valuable for our clients and how, as a financial institution, we're lifting all boats by driving economic progress with a lot of this type of giving. But it's also, our board members really see that these are culture building, reinforcing activities. And we too, around the disasters, it made me, reminded me of a program that one of my colleagues coordinated where we did packing and shipping of foods down to the disaster areas in the Caribbean. And it coincided with a day in which we had a board meeting at Goldman Sachs. And so our board members went down and they saw hundreds of people working in half-hour shifts packing food, and the opportunity for them to get their hands in, and for our people to interact with board members, for our board members to see our employees at all levels. It was really a win-win and something we plan on replicating because we realized that our board members actually hadn't had that direct exposure to some of the nonprofits we're working with.
But it goes beyond that, just to
Yeah.
pick up on that
Yeah.
example where, so we help one of the world's biggest NGO networks that begins with the word save and ends with the word children, but I won't say which one it was. And before they became fully integrated, to then put KPMG people around the world in their locations to look at how to deliver efficiencies by uniting of common operations. So for example, in parts of Africa we found, particularly in West Africa, we found that there was a Save Sweden operating and a Save UK operating in the same place. Now, that doesn't make any sense. Two different sets of funders, two different sets of people,
Yep.
same brand identity as far as the regulator is concerned, same organization. But it needed us to do kind of synergizing to help them come together. So that's where you're not actually doing the packing food distribution or giving or philanthropy, but what you're actually doing is structural reintegration, which is strategic work.
There's a next step beyond that. I think, using the capacities of your gifted employees for a positive social impact is very important. The next level beyond that is reshaping the core functions of your organization so that they generate a more positive social impact, which might be a little tricky for Goldman Sachs in some of its divisions.
But the technologists, we for sure believe in sort of using the skills of our people where we can. And so there's countless activities, whether it's our technologists doing things in their expertise outside of the office or otherwise. So absolutely agree on that.
So I'm going to shift it a little bit and ask Dixit a question. How does your company actually define social responsibility, and what kind of metrics do you use, and who is ultimately accountable to whether that happens or not?
So can I answer that first by re-characterizing the topic for this boardroom discussion?
Go for it.
And so I'm sure Vikas and his team spend much time on this, but I think the more important question to ask here is it possible for companies to do well unless they do good?
Okay.
And I think that is important to dwell on, and I know it might be controversial, but I think that is the reality that we have right now. So, whatever measure you use for ethical investing, socially responsible investing, ranking companies by that order, and there's many external vendors who've done this, if you look at the outperformance, and this is a banker-like talk again for me, if you look at the outperformance of those companies through the cycle over the last 5 years, on average, they outperform large cap stocks by around 10%. So while profits and market capitalization and economics should not be necessarily the primary driver here, what we're saying is the market rewards ethical behavior. And there may be a number of reasons for that. So you might be sourcing your talent in more efficient ways because you're tapping the widest talent pool. That might, in a very tight labor market, be affording you the ability to deal with the wage pressures that you see because you're able to recruit diversely across the globe. It may be that by virtue of you targeting what we would call ethical investments, you're entering high growth segments, and I'll throw out one as an example.
Yeah.
And again, I wanted to try and switch the discussion to more a responsible profit motive other than just CSR.
Yeah.
If you looked at the renewable sector, one should be doing it for all the climate change and environmentally good reasons. But actually, renewables are growing at about twice the rate of traditional oil and gas. And in the next 5 years, many of those sectors will dwarf the size of energy consumption in many countries. So there's a real need for banks to be focused on those elements. So I would want to reverse it back to that question and say, what's cause and effect? Of course, we've got to discuss, but I think companies will do well or will not do well unless they do good.
But do they actually think that, because, so a company in Turkey spends, that I'm associated with, they spend a lot of money and have a huge investment in wind energy. But they don't think of it as a socially responsible investment. They just see it as investment.
Business. Yeah.
It's a business. It's a profitable business. What happens then for, where does that switch happen that they start to think, okay, this isn't just about the money, it's about the climate. Is it the chairman? Is it society? Is it, where does that switch happen that then we can start saying it's not just about the money?
That's a great question. I think it is an evolution that you go through. And if you flip to another element, if you look at talent, in our industry and my industry in financial services, talent is really the oil that runs the engine for us. And so we're very sensitive to the types of talent that we get. We tend to do recruitment every year, and we need to do that at scale, and we need to do that at quality. But it has been interesting, and you touched on it a little earlier, is that when you look at millennials, millennials are the generation we recruit from right now, so that's where we've got to target our activities appropriately if we want to recruit from that labor pool. It is interesting that I saw a statistic that around 75% of millennials would rate LGBT policies of an institution as one of the key criteria they have when selecting where you go. Now, LGBT policies for firms have been in place, not necessarily in response to millennials. But now what we're seeing is the actual talent pool also start shifting, and luckily we all had been focused on it before. So I think it is an evolution that you need to go through.
There's still a very firmly held opinion that there's an efficient frontier with a trade-off between a positive social impact and maximizing financial returns. And one has to dislodge that. And that's why it's advantageous for a lot of people in alternative energy not to use the language of positive social impact or social responsibility. In the previous decade, there were a number of really disastrous clean tech investments made by venture capitalists. But I would argue that in venture capital, even more than in other areas, you need those passionate, charged up millennials who have a social mission, that the battle for talent is the crucial determinant of success. It's also a determinant of success in other ways, the orientation towards a strong social mission. One way is just that your entrepreneur is not a utility maximizer, but rather wants to solve a particular problem, and so doesn't quit when the going gets tough to do something easier. Another is that your company encounters fewer regulatory and political obstacles, and another is that there is less fraud. Right? The people who are taking advantage of one set of their stakeholders, even if it's not their customers, are much more likely to turn around and take advantage of their investors at some point. They've demonstrated their character. The only question is when they will have the opportunity to do so. But then there are a couple of other reasons why I think thinking about a positive social impact is beneficial for investment groups. One is that in venture capital in particular, there are a couple of big killers of startups, and one of them is that you build something that ultimately doesn't matter enough to anyone.
To move forward.
And so if you start off by looking at a large problem, clean water globally, or education, education of the bottom billion, at least you know you're not addressing a trivial problem. There are all sorts of other ways that things can go wrong, and my companies have found many of them. But you won't fail for that reason. And I would add a further criterion. Some people use the word additionality to describe whether the organization you are funding or working for makes a difference that nobody else would have made, right? Which I think is an important criterion. So instead of asking the question, is solar energy good? And then building another thin film solar panel company when there are 16 of them already, and each one has to spend $200 million to build a factory, and ultimately they're producing fairly similar things. You ask, is there something that this particular company is needed to do that nobody else can or will do, at least in the same way? That actually helps mitigate one of the other biggest killers of venture-backed companies, which is that there are 50 companies doing the same thing. So there are a lot of pure profit maximizers in venture capital funding food delivery companies, many of which have negative gross margins. They're actually terrible businesses. But those hard problems, we just backed a company that is focused on prisoners. Their core offering is a ruggedized tablet that sends out a distress signal when someone attempts to disassemble it. And they use that to deliver a variety of educational services, and also eventually, I hope, commissary services, because the existing companies, this is not a global problem because we have a quarter of the world's prisoners with 5% of the population. But the commissary companies take a 20% commission when relatives on the outside attempt to transfer money in, and the telephone companies that serve prisons often charge 50 cents or even $1 per minute. To the world's poorest, most vulnerable people, it's really abusive. And this company, once the tablet is in there, can do all sorts of things to disrupt those oligopolies. It's a little bit crazy. It involves hardware as well as software, and it's just different than anything else out there. And the company would have died if we hadn't funded. That's my additionality.
Right.
But it also gets rid of one problem that kills venture-backed companies, which is tons of competition.
If I could offer perspective at the other end, so you've just talked about venture capital, but on the other end, the larger corporates. I was in conversation earlier with Raj from DevX, who many of you have heard, and who's on many of the panels here, great friend and attendee here. And the question I asked him was, who do you tend to now work with in the new environment, and how do you leverage your business model? It was pretty interesting. He said, really what it is his business now is driven by large corporates, given their scale, given their complexity, given they have supply chains now that stretch across the globe, or have clients in almost every end of the globe. One of those two factors means the corporates themselves are driven to risk manage very efficiently. Now, it might be risk managing of environmental risk. It might be risk managing to ensure that they don't get hit with a lawsuit, whether it's based on discrimination or otherwise. It may be any one of those risk factors, but they're driving the risk management from their end right now. And so I think that's an interesting shift, because coming back to my original starting point, not managing those risks could be quite detrimental to your business model. So any smart board would be sitting there and saying, I understand where my revenues come from, I understand my client perimeter, but where are my risks, and what are we doing diligently to manage those? And if you're being diligent about it, then you will be focused on all of the socially responsible aspects.
It also makes me think, when you brought up just the perspective that a company like that has, and you think of Larry Fink's recent shareholder letter, and so he has the ability, controlling 4 to 5 trillion, I think, of 6 trillion in assets. And when he's writing in his letter that he believes that companies now need to have social good, that society can no longer look to governments to handle infrastructure, to handle the aging population and reskilling and all these issues, that's a real call to action. And I think that you'll see, and you would see in the VC community more than me working the philanthropic side of things, but I've got to think more and more companies will be baking this in from day one. And that's the other thing I also was thinking.
Okay, this all sounds great, but can I just play a little bit of devil's advocate? Because it sounds like you're all doing fantastic work, but at the end of the day, we still need to make money. And you're all talking about millennial investors or the millennial employees that care about this more. What is the trade-off that they're willing to accept? Because nobody's going to go in for zero return, are they? But is there a number that we can put to this?
Yes, I can quantify that quite easily.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so one of my software companies in San Francisco nurtured a talented young man until he became CTO, and then he was recruited away at 3 times the salary. He spent a year at the other company, which did not have a strong social mission, and he came back. There are people who are willing to take, in many cases, up to an 80% pay cut, particularly on the technical side, to work at a company that has a strong social mission. Now, there's also the question of equity and the potential. If you are solving a large problem, you might end up making more money in that way. But most companies don't make enormous amounts of money. No, it's how they want to spend their lives.
So for employees, around 80% pay cut. That's not been my experience, but that's fantastic.
But on that whole point about employees and millennials, in the same way the majority of our employees are under the age of 35, it is an invisible thread between the culture of the organization, whether it's Deutsche Bank or Goldman Sachs or KPMG or
Yeah.
whatever. It's this invisible thread of motivation. It's exactly why somebody comes back. If I think of the people that we have longed to hold on to the most, they've only stayed if they're actively involved in some output activity that they define as important to them. So it could be a cause, an issue, a charity, an engagement, a process, and the business gives them the affirmation to be that and to do that. They stay. We worked out a couple of years back that the loss of the attrition rate that we were having every year from the under 35s was the equivalent of the fees of our 5 largest clients around the world.
Very
So in other words, we could just have wiped out, auditing Deutsche Bank or HSBC or whatever. I just said, we're not going to bother because we're losing it on all these people drifting off. So if you keep them in because they're engaged, motivated, overwhelmed, enthused, and the place gives them that sense of empowerment and inspiration, then it saves you a ton, and they give the best of their ideas.
so interesting to quantify it that way. That's an idea I'd love to take back to my office for us to think about in that way. We're in our 3rd year of a competition at Goldman Sachs where we invite our youngest people to compete and put together a proposal, and our partnership committee, which is one of our senior-most committees at Goldman, awards them a grant to the nonprofit organization of their choosing. And Lloyd Blankfein, our CEO, on Monday asked his assistant, said, find out what's going on with that in terms of, what are the metrics around it. And we've been happy to see that we have an 8% higher retention rate of people who have participated in that competition. They feel that invisible thread, as you said. And so that's a demonstrated tool where we see a lot of people leave, go to business school after 3 years or whatever, but some of the high performers who don't want to go to business school, let's hold on to them and let's keep growing them through the firm. So tying it, it's very interesting to think of that.
I mean, I have a vivid example of someone I met at the age of 21 who was in our Sydney, Australia office, who'd spent some volunteer time in some orphanages in Kenya, who is now 32, who's still with KPMG, qualified auditor at 32, stayed all the course when most people leave after 3 to 4 years, but has moved to Kenya and has built 6 orphanages. Because that's his passion. And has formed an organization which has worldwide funding to back it. And if we'd said, oh, no, you can't possibly do that, you're an auditor, you shouldn't be involved in orphanages, it's all too risky, children, all those kind of things, he'd be off. He'd go somewhere else.
I can give you some other examples.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So if I could just touch on that, I met a young gentleman recently who's joining a premier consulting firm. And this young gentleman in his spare time is a magician. Goes to Oxford or Cambridge, a very smart kid. But this is his passion. And I said, so what are you going to do for this firm and why did you choose them? And he said, I chose them because in 2 years they've said I can go and do an MBA, which is great. But more importantly, I can take a month off every year to pursue any hobby that I have. And he didn't care that it was paid or unpaid. So just to add to that, I think it matters. What I was going to agree with you on was a topical area that's been in the news quite recently. If you look at graduate students in the US, and you probably know the stats better than me, I think females are around 60% of the graduate pool in the US.
Right.
If you look at the premier management schools, whether it's Stanford, Harvard, Wharton, I think the female intake's about 40%. And yet when you look at executive level, and this is just the United States because the data is more readily available, when you look at the executive suite, I think the percentage of women is around 16%. So your challenge is a fair one. It's not one that's lost on, I think, any of us, that we have got to keep pushing hard to ensure that not only do we bring enough female talent into the firms that we have, but more importantly, to make sure that we groom and retain them throughout. So we've got some work to do.
Okay, so that was the employee side. Let's talk a little bit about the investment side because, I know that you work for a donor-advised fund, so you work with the cream, if you like, of the investors that are already engaged in this space.
Yeah.
I mean, but if we talk more generally, and I don't want to single out your individual companies, we're talking more broadly as well, but what percentage of shareholders actually care? When was the last time that your shareholders actually pulled you up on this and said, you need to be doing more in this area, and I don't care if you earn me less 5% as long as you do more?
Larry Fink manages $6 trillion. That's
Yeah.
a very significant chunk of all of the world's liquid
resources,
financial
Yeah.
assets.
And it was a great statement,
Yeah.
and we're all going to be following it
And it's the
closely.
fourth year he's done it, so it's not just like it appeared in 2018.
No, he's been working on it. I think that he feels that, well, he said a couple of things in there. One, they're going to come with the pitchforks and torches for you if you don't do this. Global inequality must be addressed by corporations. Another is it's financially irresponsible for the board not to have a strategy for social impact. We are putting you on notice. We will exercise, even in our index funds, we have governance rights. We will exercise those powers to unseat the board that does not take its responsibilities in that area seriously. And there are a number of other organizations. I think if you add up Goldman Sachs Asset Management, UBS, which backed a sister fund of mine, Goldman Sachs is actually a limited partner in my fund. All of the world's largest asset managers are starting to move in this direction, in some cases for purely financial reasons, because the next gens, the wealthy next generation family members who have money stashed with them, and also the pension funds are exerting a strong pressure, and they will lose an entire generation of clients if they don't have a story about that. But it's also just rational and prudent finance. It's a risk filter, as several of us have said in different ways.
And a good way of measuring that, which we all know about around this table, are the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. And if you track back to the foundation of those UNPRI principles 15 years ago, frankly, everybody was laughing. And now we're at about roughly 60% of all assets under management are registered with the UN Principles on Responsible Investment.
A fifth of the, to your point, a fifth of the AUM pool in the US, by estimates, is actually driven through social responsible metrics to one extent or another. So I think, not doing it potentially means you're not eligible for index inclusion. If you're not eligible for index inclusion, you will suffer from the underperformance that you see in companies that are not in that category of ethical companies.
I would say that the companies that don't have a strong social responsibility orientation are also just companies that are lacking in vision.
That's right.
That are not aware of where the opportunities are. The Singularity University collaborations with large corporations in their innovation organizations are taking companies like, say, Caterpillar or I think Target that are in, or Lowe's actually, that are in very competitive industries. In some cases are shrinking, in other cases growing slightly, and saying, here's a problem, the lack of global availability of clean water, which is a titanic global problem. If you, Caterpillar, figure out some way to address this problem, it could be worth a multiple of your current total market cap, right? So it's a growth-oriented mindset.
But in the scheme of things, Ayla, to your point, this is a relatively recent discussion.
Yes.
So I feel I joined Goldman Sachs in 2008, just before the financial crisis. And certainly when that happened, I had my parents calling saying, do you still have a job? But the firm thankfully stayed its course with our philanthropy. So we were very prepared going into the annual shareholders meeting every May for shareholders who would raise questions about, is it right to put $100 million behind women's education as we had in 2007, 2008. So in those early days, we had all the tough Q&A ready for our CEO and our CFO to answer in those meetings. And there would be, on rare occasion, that question. I feel like when I think of the trajectory of this, and a few years down the road, Michael Porter and others wrote about shared value, and having that publication, I think, come out from the imprimatur of Harvard Business School, and that really started moving the dialogue. And you just saw it more in international fora like this, that discussion of everything we've said here. And so now I feel like, to your point, it really is essential to businesses that are being built, but it's, in the scheme of things, this is a relatively new conversation.
So let me ask you then as a follow-up, or you can answer because I know you have something to add. We certainly seem to be talking the talk, and that's great. The dialogue is out there, the discourse is happening, and it's happening at various different high levels. But walking the walk can often take a longer time, and it can be in a multitude of ways. Do you think there's a gap between the talk and the walk?
There will always be bad actors in any ecosystem, so I think you can carve those out because that's quite normal, and that will get weeded out of the system over time. But what I would say is the consequences of not actually being focused on these elements for any large corporation can be quite devastating. Think about an environmental disaster. You skimp on security, that might cost you $10, $15 billion. If you think of our industry with banking and you look at the fines that have occurred, big incentive to make sure that you operate properly. And I think the change factor for me in the last 20 years really has been information flows so quickly that any mispractice or malpractice anywhere in the globe, in your institution, will get flagged up very quickly. So the consequences of not doing it are very high and devistating. And
Do you
hence
have
I
an
think people are
experience of that?
focused on it.
Well,
Something being flagged up for what you didn't do enough of?
well, a mountain, an organization as big as ours. I mean, but to go back to your starting point there, which is the gap between the rhetoric and the outcome, there has to be one. Because big organizations, even at 35,000 or 200,000 or however many in Deutsche Bank, big organizations need people to get the point.
Yeah.
And it takes time. You can't order people to do things that are necessary to require inspiration, energy, covenant, and commitment. You do need them to move progressively. But also, what we'd all believe very firmly in is that if you're going to do something that is systemically transformational, you want it to become systemically sustainable. That means you better do it really well. That means you've got to do it over the long term. You're going to change policy on something. You've got to think that policy through very carefully. Or you're going to do action. You better build something that's going to stand up. Now, again, that's not in the rush space. One of the other things that I'm literally concluding in May, we spent 9 years building a village community in Tanzania. 9 years on something in an area where we have no business whatsoever. It's on an island off the coast of Tanzania. There is no benefit to KPMG whatsoever. But this is 9 years, many millions of dollars, 10,000 people, a continuous progressive investment of skills, time, money, support to enable them to have a long-term sustainable life, a community abandoned by the Tanzanian government and disregarded by other NGOs. And a business comes in because we were asked to do so by Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University, and we said, okay, the choice is to either say, yes, do it, or press the delete button and don't do it. So, but you have to rev people up to inspiration, and then you have to move them to the building phase, and then you've got to stick with it. You've got to turn it into something meaningful. And I finally signed it off in the last week of May and go there. It's all handed over to the government of Zanzibar. We've done the job, but it's 9 years.
Can I just add to that? So I think the largest problems that exist out there, whether, for example, healthcare, education, which is the topic for the 2 days that we're here, all of those require what you've just said, which is a public-private cooperation and partnership if you're really wanting to solve those. So a company cannot enter into one of those markets hoping to generate a profit if they aren't actually changing the engagement model with the state. And therein lies, I think, a change in mindset at board level as to playing the long game, making sure you have an engagement model that is conducive towards long-term returns, because there won't be much you can do in the short term.
So let me pick up on the whole public-private partnership then. We all work in highly regulated sectors. What can the government do, or what kind of regulatory changes can be brought about that would actually enhance or narrow down this gap between the talk and the walk? Is there a role that can be played there by the government to make sure that we're doing more, that the company is doing well and good?
Well, do we want government to play?
I'm asking you.
I'm not sure we necessarily want government to be... I mean, the Indian government has encouraged, regulated that companies should set aside 2% of their revenues into a fund that delivers social responsibility activity, but it doesn't have sufficient definition. It doesn't. It's almost impossible to manage and monitor how that money is used carefully. So companies just plonking it away and sometimes giving it away, not thinking about what can we do to really make it structurally significant. Now that comes as a result of a governmental push. I'm not so sure that's delivered the best possible outcome. I'd rather see that companies choose to do this because, not just because Larry Fink writes great letters, and he does, and we all need to follow that, but because we actually believe in it.
There's one very specific governmental initiative. You see it in Norway and Sweden and in Canada to some extent, and that's just directing sovereign wealth money or pension funds into impactful investments.
Yes.
But other than that, I fear that any initiative would lend itself to lobbying and distortion and the direction of money to special interests. And to return to that earlier question, there is a real problem once it becomes an imperative to have a positive social impact, that people do what some call greenwashing in the environmental area. They perform a cosmetic change in response to the new requirements, or even rush in with a fake impact vehicle to address a new mandate. But I think, also, if we have Larry Fink and Stephen Schwartzman and Henry Kravis on our side, we don't need governments.
Okay.
Just to add to that,
Hands off government.
And Anna would know this because she manages money for all of these folks. There's a $500 billion through the Giving Pledge and like initiatives from the ultra highest of high net worth individuals. And so now you have the power that used to reside in countries before. The scale of that power now resides with a handful of individuals that have the ability to impact or have an impact on all of these problems in a way that we never could before. And it is my impression that they have understood that the model, if you're attempting to create large-scale change over a sustainable period, that does require government involvement. Those big problems cannot get addressed without government at the table. And I think the $500 billion group has figured that out.
Yes. If I take a vivid example of, so I visited the M-Pesa Academy in Nairobi in January, and that's a school funded by the mobile money network M-Pesa, set up by Vodafone and the UK's Dixit development organisation way back sort of 15 years ago. Now it's become a multi-billion fund. Of course, there's a profit made off of each transaction, and from that, a school for 800 of the poorest kids from the most extreme edges of Kenya have been created, a boarding school where I have seen a higher quality of facilities than I have seen at the best of the British schools. I've been to Eton in the UK, has nothing on what the M-Pesa Academy in Kenya has got. Now, as a result of creating that school and drawing in the kids and providing the best technology and the best quality of education, the best learning experience, the government of Kenya is looking in saying, this is happening under our watch, in our place, with our kids, from our communities. What can we learn from the experience of this and transform the rest of the education system? So the faculty and the chief executive are working with the ministers and the departments of the Kenyan government to achieve that transformational change. Now, I suspect, and I'm not being unkind to Kenyan government, but I suspect they may not have quite got there had it not been for the push of a private business doing it on its own to begin with. And I think that's a real, that's a lever for transformation.
Yeah, I think most of us probably feel that, and I think in the role of philanthropy, whether it's private philanthropy or however you're structured, have that ability to do this sort of interesting and creative, some will call it risk capital or whatever you want to call it, but that is sort of the ability that we have. And then certainly I think we all probably have designed programs where then it is the government that can scale it. And we've done that quite a lot at Goldman Sachs too. And I would think that's, for us, I think the value that we see, that when we can take a program only so far, but then the UK government or whomever it is can take it to that next level, that's the real win-win.
I would nuance that. A lot of the companies that I back are in K-12 education, so they sell to governmental entities, not at the national level or even the state level usually, but school districts most typically. And yes, you have to approach them in a spirit of partnership, otherwise the product will not work. But at the same time, if you think about the things that are most transformative, I'll give the example of Google Apps for Education, G Suite. If you went to the superintendent of the district and said, we think you need to switch to a student-centered, personalized, self-paced, collaborative, project-based approach to teaching, they would say, yes, well, look at the teachers I've got. We've got to implement this Common Core initiative. We have a lot of other things to do. How could we possibly manage students working at different paces? But if you say, how would you like to use Gmail instead of Exchange? They say, okay. And the next thing you know, you have cloud-based applications being used by students and teachers, and there is collaboration occurring. And then there's a fact on the ground, which they must deal with, and so there's a bottom-up change. So you need that kind of public-private partnership as well.
Okay, do you think that we should set targets? You know, the international development community, they set a target, not that everyone adhered to it, but a certain amount should go to international aid, and I think the UK is one of the few countries along with Scandinavia and some Nordic countries that adhere to that, or quotas for women on boards. Do you think that we should have a target or a quota for whether it be ethical investment or whether it be for the amount of your revenue or profits that go to?
I'd like to talk about my firm's record, which I'm proud of. So I'm on 3 board seats within our portfolio right now. All 3 companies have female CEOs. We've now backed 6 African-American entrepreneurs, including 4 women. The total number of African-American women who have raised over $1 million in the entire history of the venture capital industry in the US is 18. Now, did we make financial compromises to focus on talent from every quarter? No. Our first fund made 20 investments. We've lost money only on 1 of them. Ask your friends in venture capital what their loss ratios are, and it will be higher, for sure. I think that, we were just talking about the global war for talent. How can you possibly rule out 55, 51% of the human race? Or, there are a number of other exclusion categories besides gender. LGBTQ, how many transgender CEOs? We have come close to investing with a couple of transgender CEOs. There are really not very many out there in the CEO role. They have a different perspective. They're addressing problems often related to their own personal experience, and there are opportunities there. There is a severe bias within my industry, and probably in yours too, towards prestige degrees. Failing to recognize that if someone went to Stanford or Oxford, that probably means they come from a relatively affluent family background. So, what is it, Oxford Brooks? Instead, if you go there to a polytechnic, it's not that you're looking at people who are less talented, you're looking at people who are less affluent. Right? So you need to relax that filter. There's also in venture capital an age bias towards the young. And that is a very destructive and weird bias. And so in intersectional terms, if I can find a CEO who is over 50 and who's a woman, I pay extra attention because I know that many venture capitalists will screen that person out, particularly if she went to a community college and then to a second-tier state school, right? And that is an opportunity for me.
But did you, sorry, I just want to challenge him a little bit. Not
do.
challenge, but did you have to, you say there was no financial compromise, but did you have to work harder to actually get those people?
We worked very hard at it in the first fund, and we ended up with only 3 female CEOs out of 20. But just that effort started to really pay off in the second fund. And for a while, we were at over 50%. We are now
pay off in financial terms or pay off in?
It paid off in terms of the diversity,
Deal
the
flow.
breadth of backgrounds of our CEOs. It is not, second fund has not yet had time to pay off in financial terms.
So you don't think that we should be going about setting ourselves targets? Just make sure that we work hard to get what we want and not necessarily have a numerical figure that we want to achieve?
I think you have to pressure them not to have targets, but to make a commitment to diversity and to think very seriously about the the aspects of their organization that might be off-putting to people from diverse backgrounds.
Okay, you want to say something here?
Yeah, so in my day job, I spend all my time managing risk, and over the years, the one thing that's that's dawned on me is that if you can't measure it, you seldom will be managing it, and you won't really be able to mitigate it. So I think away from necessarily saying we have a target of X, let's at least start putting that on your scorecard, so that in the same way as you look at revenues, you look at cost, you look at risks, you look at data, you look at technology, you have these aspects on there as well, so that we have an intellectually honest starting point when you're having that discussion. And then you can go through and say, I have worked hard at it, we've done the following, and we have not succeeded because of. But I would like to start with an intellectually honest base. So, can't answer the question necessarily whether you have a target. I think you should have an aspiration for sure, because again, without an aspiration, you'll never get there. But measuring it is important.
Is it on your scorecard?
Yes. So it depends which
What kind of
metrics,
metric are you using?
Diversity,
okay.
for example, would be one that you could measure, but you could pick on all of those. You could pick a metric that you feel comfortable enough that you have the tools available at your disposal to be able to manage. And again, like anything else that you do, you had a revenue plan that was based on the previous year's aspirational. You missed your revenue plan. Why did you miss your revenue plan? I missed it because of market conditions. I missed it because of volatility. I missed it because we misexecuted. Sorry.
Do you have on your scorecard?
We do. I mean, we certainly have gone out there, and we have lots of room to improve. But I was thinking, all of us at the table here are in people businesses, and so we know for sure that diversity and innovation are tied, and that means diversity on all of the metrics that we're talking about: ethnicity, background, affluency, gender, et cetera. So we have goals that we're moving towards, and we realize that we start very well. And of course, women in senior management at Goldman Sachs, it's too low. And so we know we have to make moves on that, and we are. And I think for us, we really it is a competitive advantage in this globalized world to have diverse perspectives at the table when we're all vying for the same clients. So for us, it's something we're trying to make a move on.
He's burning to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
How many people in the audience work for NGOs? Yeah, so I've taught students who had worked for places like the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, the UN, and so on. I always thought it was peculiar the way that they would send a team of PhD economists into the field to assess the problem in Tanzania, then come back to the central office, make a recommendation, vote on it, and then implement something, which often would be out of touch with aspects of local norms. So I'm working on an essay on what I call the chief empathy officer. So why not take one of those people from Tanzania back to the home office? And then I thought a little bit further than that. What about your boards? Like, why not take one of those perhaps illiterate but extremely bright people from that village in Tanzania back to the home office and put her on the board of Goldman Sachs? Now, there would be some risks attached to that, but I think the diversity in point of view that you would gain would be tremendous. And I don't know, maybe Goldman Sachs wouldn't be the right organization to try this.
I'm just trying to visualize
I'll bring that back.
No, I think
how it's going to work. It sounds good.
But for God's sake, the Ford Foundation for sure ought to do this right away.
Yeah.
Tell me about diversity on your boards, then. It doesn't have to be an illiterate person from...
We actually have a fairly...
And not just
diverse,
women.
But yeah, but right. No, but our lead director is of African-American heritage. But I think McKinsey actually recently did a really interesting report by Dame Vivian Hunt and the tie in diversity. And she was talking about, and this was on the record, SAP, which, whether it's a client of theirs or not, but they are even putting people, talk about sort of all the levels of diversity. So people on the autistic spectrum on each team, because of the different approach and their mind just works in a different way. And it was just lovely to hear. I mean, it gave me chills to think of, for friends we all have who have been touched by that and the struggles of an autistic family. But the respect now that that's just a brain operating in a different way and new perspectives. I mean, talk about sort of the open door we have now, I think, to diversity in all of its glory and beauty. You know?
Yeah.
I think, and you make a really good point, and what I wanted to add was that in a world where you have many commoditized skills, so even coding, for example, we've gone through this phase where coding's a big
In
focus,
vogue,
and
yeah.
it does get you logically focused and so on, but actually coding's becoming a commoditized skill right now. The skills that at more of a premium are those where you look at the client and say, what's the client experience going to be like? What's the product that we need to deliver? Because I can outsource that to a number of people who are the experts behind the scenes. When I shop on Amazon, I don't really care whether they use AI or anything else, because I click a button and it materializes and it actually gets done. And I think that multidisciplinary skill that you need is going to change the type of recruitment that we have, and is changing the type of recruitment, to your point. So call it diversity, call it adapting to a world where you have a lot more technology and AI and the fourth industrial revolution. All of it really means you need to recruit in a very smart way, and I think by necessity that means multidisciplinary teams.
I was just going to add that.
Please.
So the word diversity is a very important word, no question about it. It can be just about metrics, knowing the numbers, and you could look at whether it's color or race or LGBT or whatever, and you could just get all these kind of
Tomorrow it'll be
metrics.
something else.
It could be something else, animal care, who cares? But we've gone towards inclusion and diversity rather than diversity, because the mindset you've got to have is that irrespective of whether I understand you, I will include you within how I need to think and to hear and to act and to operate. So it's a philosophical approach about a deliberate attempt to include people of difference before you then get on to just measuring the metrics of difference. And that, I hope, is going to be more transformative in the long term.
It's so true. I heard someone recently said, diversity is getting a bunch of different people to the dance. Inclusion means inviting them to dance.
That's it, exactly.
And it was
yeah.
sort of a nice analogy to help.
Inclusion's the
truth.
positive.
Positive.
Up
Okay,
front.
I'm going to open up for any questions. If you don't have any, I've still got a couple I can throw out there.
Behind you.
I've got 1, 2, 3. Oh, you've got the mic, so you start, and then I'll go behind.
I have to type this question while the discussion was going on, because I thought I was going to lose it. So my question is twofold. How frequently, this discussion is for all of you who's on the panel, because you spoke a lot about social responsibility and measuring your profitability unless you're doing good, something like that. Okay, so my question is this. How do you financially support NGOs and individual organizations who are clearly and demonstrably working for the good of the community? And what measures do you put in place for such organizations to access and monitor funds for the projected purpose? Many of us have placed up our hands. We probably work with NGOs. We probably have individual courses we want to pursue passionately. For instance, I'm a teacher, but I want to transfer my teaching skills from the UK to West Africa. Who's going to support me? I still teach. I still need to earn a living. But I see the gaps between teachers in the UK and in West Africa. I want to help. There are big organizations doing a lot, but there are other certain things that are left out. You spoke about diversity. I'm also thinking about inclusion. I'm thinking about the youths of West Africa who are being marginalized from year to year. So please, how do you address this? Do you make this difficult for NGOs, or do you make it easy for them to be able to access funds and actually implement these funds in the right way?
Thank you.
So
just one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then please just take one of the questions. Behind here. So maybe, Anne, you could take that question from the lady.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on a point Michael Hastings made. I work for New University, and you talked about long-term investment in Zanzibar,
Pemba.
for a project that had no connection to your business strategy.
That's right. Yeah.
I find it fascinating because I believe that the corporate sector actually teaches and drives how the NGO sector behaves with money, relates to money, and thinks about outcomes. Because in the 15 years that I worked in that sector, certainly post-recession, the attitude to outcome as opposed to output has changed, because our funders made us change that outlook to quite an extent. And there was always examples of good practice, but on the whole, the sector outlook changed because we were being asked to report in a certain way. What I find really interesting now is, I can give you two quick examples. I have to raise money for disabled veterans in a scholarship and a teacher education and systemic change program in India. Whilst everybody believes teacher education and systemic change in India is absolutely required, most corporates are unwilling to engage with it because it's a long-term systemic change thought process with nothing immediate to show an output. Disabled veterans, very sexy, straight in the news, scholarships, most of them are lining up to support something like that. How does the corporate sector, exemplars of best practice, help the corporate world think about long-term versus short-term or mid-term?
Thank you.
I'll
Final
take that
question
one,
here, and then we'll take some.
as it was addressed to
So
me.
this conference is about education.
And we didn't talk about education, you're going to say?
Well, no, it's about education, and I'm delighted that Goldman Sachs have put so much funding into girls' education. But I would be interested to know how one gets, with all the demands on corporate social responsibility budgets and efforts, how one gets education high or higher up the importance
Yeah.
of large organisations. Not simply your own ones, but actually large corporations generally.
Thank you. So, Anne,
I'll take that question.
yep, and this one, and maybe one of you two can take the last question.
Okay.
Well, I was going to say, in general for us, and I mean, a couple of the points. So on that, education, I mean, I think we all, there's so many ways in which education ties to our firm, which is why it's been sort of a natural area for us to fund. We obviously are recruiting from all of these schools, and so the development of that pipeline is important to us. We have relationships with all of those recruiting and officers at these schools. And again, it goes to everything we've been discussing, that we want sort of the diversity of perspective that comes and from that relationship. And then I think to your question, when we're talking about sort of the sector and the nonprofit sector, I mean, I think we've always, from where we sit, they're experts in their fields like you, more so than me. And so we've sought to find sort of the best experts in these areas across a given range of topics, whether it's early childhood education or arts and culture, whatever it might be. And while I think the entry points are all different to all of our different corporations and how we manage that type of thing, I think having the respect of knowing that we don't know what we don't know, that's one of the most important tools that we look to your community to bring to us.
Sir?
Just on that point about the long term and so on, the thing that I've observed, I've been going to the World Economic Forum in Davos for the last 12 years. And what I've observed, and my colleagues here can tell me whether they think I'm completely mad or not, is that as the argument about positive sustainable inclusion has grown and grown and grown, as business leaders have embraced their position of directional leadership, as the Larry Fink letters have got more and more common, that there is a mood around amongst business executives that says, we don't have to quantify this in a business plan that shows inputs, outputs, outcomes, profit, measures, all of that. Or we just need to say, this is right to do. And that momentum is becoming increasingly apparent. In our case, the investment in that community on Pemba Island, just north of Zanzibar, was, I remember the chairman saying to me, what is the business plan? And I said, there isn't one. They said, well, how are we going to know what we achieve? I said, we don't at the moment. We just have to get on and do it. This is virgin territory for us. We don't know how we're going to achieve all of this, but we've got to try. And so I think there's a will to do it, which is out there in the bit. You know, my colleagues from Deutsche Bank and Goldman Sachs would agree with that. That's a new mood in business.
Mm-hmm. So there's a burning question there, so I'm going to take that. But could you, Matt, in the meantime, answer the question on how do we get education on top of the agenda of these big, large corporations? Everyone, we're at an education conference.
Well, I think it's already on top of the agenda because there's a problem recruiting adequate talent. But also, I think we're moving towards a future in which routine tasks will increasingly be automated rapidly. And as strange as it sounds to say, 80% of your job as a knowledge worker will be educating yourself, and 20% will be applying the knowledge. some of us are already there. So any organization that is not thinking about continuing education and continuing intellectual engagement of its employees is not going to have the employees that will help it survive.
Yeah.
It is pushing on an open door within institutions. So to your point, within the budget that's available, I think education actually for most institutions would rank really number one, number two in terms of issues that need focus.
I'm sorry, I've been told I can't take the final question, but I'm sure that we're all going to be here. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our wonderful boardroom.